Hello, my name is Caleb. Welcome to this week's lesson. Last week we looked at how God protects and provides for the vulnerable ultimately in the gospel, and how he calls his people to reflect Christ's likeness in showing aid to the vulnerable as well. And there were specific structures put in place. As soon as God started forming his covenant with his people, he's establishing this as a way of living for his people, which heightens the importance of it. The title of this week's lesson is Inhabited. We're in Exodus chapter 40, verses 16 through 21, and then verses 34 through 38. The memory verse is Exodus 40:34. The theme is God makes his presence known when his people work together to obey him. In this week's lesson, we see that God reveals his glory to his people. The past few weeks, I've woken early to go out to turn my vehicle on because it's cold weather and you got to heat up the vehicle, get that oil heated up. And there's been truly some amazing sunrises that have taken place, and I've had to just pause, take a picture of it, and just enjoy the beauty of God's glory reflected in creation. Buckingham Palace is a truly amazing building that came far away from its early beginnings as a muddy, marshy landscape when William Blake first built his home there, later Queen Victoria expanding it, and now we see it for the spectacle that it is today. The royal flag standard is flown when the Queen, now King, is in residence. Why do you think they do this custom? In Exodus 24, 1 through 8, the people committed themselves to God's covenant. It was time to build, but sin entered. As the impatient Israelites, waiting for Moses to descend Mount Sinai in God's majestic holy presence, they compelled Aaron to use the precious jewels, the gold of Egypt, to make them a golden calf, which was a counterfeit for the worshiping of Yahweh. It's amazing how you can make an excuse for idolatry and say it's worshiping God. And this was a forbidden image in chapter 32, verses 1 through 6. They would have been completely wiped out, but Moses interceded on their behalf. Only 3,000 people were killed, and God did send a chastening plague throughout Israel. Their sin created a distance in their fellowship with God, according to Exodus 33, 3 through 6. Moses, however, enjoyed intimate communication and fellowship as he continued to talk with God in Exodus 33:11. Described as friendship, this interaction was as Moses could catch a glimpse of God's glory without seeing God's face. In Exodus 34, it shows us a renewal of their covenantal commitment. On the heels of God granting forgiveness and restoration, he formed two brand new stone tablets, as Moses had broken the original stones in his indignation. God promises to remove the Canaanites, and in chapters 35 through 39, the Tabernacle building project is described. Point number 1, instructions followed. In these verses, Moses is commended for his obedience here and elsewhere, just simply doing what God said. This was the nation of Israel's first New Year's Day, and God, by his grace, had brought them through so much. There was an open-air section in the open courtyard, and there was an enclosed holy place and the Holy of Holies. The testimony in verse 20 are the two replaced stone tablets of God's law. The Ark of the Covenant, the Ark of Testimony, was covered by the mercy seat, meaning it was a place of atonement, showing how God guarded this holy covenant. God's presence had not yet rested on the tabernacle, and they used poles to transport the ark because it was holy. It was gravely serious that it not be touched. And that is how serious God takes his holiness. The curtain screen sealed of the Holy of Holies, and only once a year would the high priest enter until God ripped it from top to bottom when Jesus made the final ultimate sacrifice on the cross in Matthew chapter 27, verses 50 through 51. The discussion question is, in what areas are you tempted to offer partial obedience instead of full obedience? They don't cut to the chase. They do cut to the chase in that question. That is a soul-searching question right there. And it's a good question that we need to ask ourselves. Point number 2, Tabernacle Inhabited, covering verses 34 through 35. Exodus 40, verse 33 says, "And he erected the court around the tabernacle and the altar, and set up the screen of the gate of the court. So Moses finished the work." This is echoed when Solomon finishes the temple building in 1 Kings 7:51. They echo the far greater work of God in Genesis 2:2, when God finished when God finished his creation work. The gospel is seen here in John 19:30. Jesus cried that his work of suffering for our redemption was finished, that we might dwell in his presence forever. God's presence is described as a cloud. Glory is the word, kavod, meaning be heavy, meaning honor and splendor. The cloud hovered and the glory filled the tabernacle. A recommended passage to pray through is Exodus 40:34 through 35. The next discussion question is, how do we know when we have been in God's presence? How do we know when we have been in God's presence? Point number 3, guidance given, covering verses 36 through 38. The key doctrine is the doctrine of God. Lifeway says God is infinite in holiness and all other perfections on page 116, citing 1 Samuel 2:2, which says, there is none holy like the Lord, for there is none besides you. There is no rock like our God. What a great verse. The cloud would continue to lead Israel to the promised land as before. In verse 36, we are assured of his presence, repeated to Joshua in Joshua 1:5, that he would have success as a result of God's presence, and repeated in the Great Commission of Jesus to his disciples, that God's presence would be with them. God's presence makes all the difference. Just like they remained until God led them to move out, we too are guided by the Holy Spirit of God's indwelling presence, according to Romans 8, verse 14. They witnessed it with their eyes in the cloud and the fire by night, hovering and glowing over the tabernacle. What a magnificent sight that must have been. Jesus ultimately revealed God's glory, which we will someday see in full fruition in the new kingdom when we see him face to face. His presence, teaching, his miracles, his countenance, all pointed to God the Father. Jesus replaced the tabernacle as our place of dwelling with God, Revelation 21:3. Closing discussion question: what happens when we try to move ahead of God? God bless you as you teach this lesson this coming week.